Good afternoon and welcome to the Designing for Neurodiversity webinar on RIBA Academy. Now, today is a really special week, Neurodiversity Celebration Week, and we've sponsored this webinar to coincide with the week, and it's sponsored by RIBA Enable Community. In 2021, we set up the Enable Community. It's a group of staff with lived experience of disability and neurodiversity, and it's a safe space for group members to highlight the challenges they face, sharing their insight and feedback to create meaningful change in the organisation at RIBA and across architecture. I'm Publishing Director at RIBA. I work with colleagues on the journal, on the book publishing programme, on the bookshop, on jobs. But today I'm here as the chair of the RIBA Enable Community. It's immensely exciting because this is our first external Enable event and also the first year that we're marking the Neurodiversity Celebration Week. For those who are not already aware of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, it's an international initiative that seeks to redirect the conversation around neurodiversity from one that tends to focus negatively on its challenges towards its strengths and talents. Architects and designers are in a unique position to make a difference in this regard by making positive contributions to people's lives through the environments they design. And today, we're lucky enough to have 3 expert speakers with both learned and lived experience, Jane Simpson, Helen Kane, and Jean Hewitt. The session's going to start with a general introduction to inclusive design from Jane Simpson, and then we're going to move on to talking specifically about designing for neurodiversity, and that's firstly from Helen Kane, and finally, we're going to have an introduction to the new BSI standard PAS 6463 from Jean Hewitt. Now, Jane is a chartered architect and registered access consultant. She's over 30 years experience in inclusion. Throughout her career, she's developed a broad range of expertise working with a local authority background, private practice and planning departments. And Jane's going to give us that kind of broader context around inclusive design. And then Helen's going to pick up. Helen Kane is a director of Neuro by Design and Access Included Limited. She's an innovative expert in inclusive environment issues, and she draws on a career of over 3 decades working at director level in a variety of property roles. She's known for her ability to identify the key issues quickly and for being incisive and inclusive. So I'm going to hand over now to Jane and Helen.
Firstly, I want to welcome everybody. A special thanks to RIBA for putting this event on, but also to ICE for sharing this with their members, because I'm sure the debate will be much more fulfilling with having a full diversity of participants. Now, as Helen Castle said, please type in your questions. So today, we're going to hear from 2 of my very best friends, colleagues and fellow NRAC consultants, Helen Kane and Jean Hewitt. Now, Helen Castle has introduced me. 2 Helens is getting quite confusing. But for the benefit of those who don't know me, I am an architect and I have been involved in inclusive design for over 3 decades. In fact, I think I've been involved with RIBA since about 2002, and I can track that I represented them on the DIPTAC, the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee Built Environment Group. So I think most of the time is really needed from Helen and Jean. So I'm just going to quickly set the scene. In the UK, we've had legislation concerning equality for decades, which naturally has implications on the built environment. Now, everybody has heard of the DDA, but please do not say that. The Equality Act has been in place for 12 years now and is concerned with far more than just disability. Now, legislation is often the stick, but what I want to stress is the carrot. Legislation is often a stick, but what I want to stress is the carrot. We're all individuals, whether you're a designer, an employer, a service provider or educator. You'll want to know what we can do to reduce discrimination, increase equity and productivity, creating an environment which welcomes and celebrates. There is a rise in the awareness and desire to ensure our environments meet all needs. So I will hand over to our other speakers to explain in greater depth and understanding than I can give around neurodiversity. And again, please stress, can you post questions, please? And now I'm going to hand over to Helen.
Thank you. First of all, may I say, don't adjust your sets. I have a reasonable adjustment today. I have an infection on this side of my face and it's completely swollen, so I'm in the shadows. Sorry about the voice, but the one thing about neurodivergent people is we don't give up easily, so let's carry on. I'm here today to talk about neurodiversity and design, and I'm focusing on the neuro part before Jean takes over the technical parts. So I am with Access Inclusion. I'm a member of the ICE Fairness, Inclusion and Respect panel in Wales, and I deal with biophilic design, accessible active travel, and very much engagement. It's very important to listen to people, and by background I'm a surveyor. Next. Okay, so very simply, neurodiversity is just neuro, which is the brain, and diversity, which is a difference between people's brains. Nothing more than that. So some of the things I've put in the brain shape there may change between everybody, but particularly in certain situations. I'm sure you recognise all these. Words, numbers, dexterity, how you focus on things, speech, empathy, the list goes on. But everybody's brain is really different, and neurodiversity is just the biological certainty of variations in our sensory perception, processing, storage, and reaction. So some of the results that research has produced about designing for neurodiversity, I've split into positives and negatives. So the reduction of stress and pain, which I could do with a bit of right now, absenteeism from the office, staff turnover, your blood pressure and heart rate will be positively affected, and muscular tension, problem solving and creative abilities are a particular asset in neurodivergence, and sensory overload. So what we've improved, so the research says, is our health, our cognitive performance, efficiency, mental focus, attentiveness, problem solving, creation, and recovery rates. So there's a bit of a mix in both of those, isn't there? Some have reduced and some have improved. We'll talk about the brain. Don't panic, it's going to be very simple. So the very essential part of the brain is the initial signal comes into our reptilian complex, which has evolved over time, and it's based on our experience in the savannah, trying to get away from dinosaurs and things. So the initial response will come in and you get a gut reaction, and it's this gut reaction which will produce the fight or flight effect, and you can just see the diagram of the fight or flight effects there. It's as if you're going to be attacked. It's an age-old thing. Your mouth gets dry, your stomach wants to remove its contents so you can run faster, your heart beats faster, breathing, your vision changes, and your leg muscles are tense. So that's the initial reaction that you might get if you get a signal from the environment that there's a danger or a complication. And from there on, all the messages flow out into the outer parts of your brain, and they're processed all over the place, very, very complex. And they come into the neocortex, where you have billions and billions of neurons dealing with separate aspects. So there's about 11 billion signals going on there at any one time. The next slide is about our senses. Now, this is the basis of designing for neurodiversity. Our senses react in very different ways. Everyone is individual completely. So you'll know about the common senses, the smell, touch, hearing. But there are another two that are particularly described in the new PAS. One is balance, and one is another one, which is basically about perception. It's proprioception, and it's an awareness of your movement through space, where you are at a particular time, and also your internal awareness of how your body is working. And they are particularly being discussed as part of neurodiversity. The other thing I should mention is proxemics, which is introduced in the PAS. that's simply about how people feel about where they are in space. So we all have our certain boundaries. We feel inhibited about being too close or too far, might be for any reason, but the circle on the right has described how the different areas line up. So your personal space is up to 1.5 meters. And if people encroach on that, they might feel really uncomfortable. So just quickly run through a few of the senses. Nothing great. Vision takes up about 50% of the processing area of our brains, which is called the cortex. And you can see how complicated it is. We have different areas for doing different things. So a signal will come in, and then we'll have it, you know, is it an object? Is it a color? What's the light? Does it move? It's very, very complicated. And the most complicated thing is faces. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but faces can't be processed upside down. They're that complicated. So if you turn the same face upside down, you won't be able to recognize it. But the important thing about vision is that we choose what to prioritize and process in our brains. We can only manage 40 to 50 items out of the 11 billion signals that are going on. So we make our own priorities subconsciously, and we ignore fractal patterns. There's a picture of an eyeball there. Now, our eyes have blood vessels running through them, and they are fractal patterns. They're natural, irregular, but organized patterns. We look out through those patterns, but our brain chooses to ignore them. And we choose to ignore quite a lot of other things as well. And we also make things up with our vision. Where we see a gap, we'll reimagine it. So if you focus on the dot, I'm sure you've seen this test before, if you focus on the dot, eventually your brain will join up the line there. So we make a lot up all the time. And the next slide is hearing. So we have 50% of our brain is processing vision, but for hearing, there's only 3%, and it's much simpler. So the signals come in through our ears and are processed very quickly. So we get a faster response sometimes. But of course, hearing can be muffled or distorted or reflected or absorbed. So there are a lot of things that can go on, but the basic signal is much faster than vision. Touch tells us where we are in space, and apparently if we touch more, if we're very tactile with people, it makes us trust people more, and we tip more generously. So it's always worth being a little bit tactile in a restaurant, isn't it? And the next slide please, is smell. Smell doesn't take up very much processing at all. It's only 1% with taste. So again, it's really simple. It comes up and it's processed and stored. We have a very wide range of smell. We've got 450 receptors, which means we've got 1 trillion smells that we can process. And partly because of this, we can recall memory really quickly through smell. So if you try and imagine freshly mown grass, it'll come to you quite quickly. But you know, try and remember an old friend's address. It might be really difficult. So smell is very important. So the important thing about senses is that they don't work in isolation, they work together, and they work better together. And sometimes when you take away one of those sensory inputs, they don't work, or they create distortion. So the image on the right is what's called a Stroop test. If you look at the colors and the words and try to read out the color rather than the word, you will have some distortion. And that's because the areas for language and color are located next to each other, so they distort each other. And there are lots of things that go on with the senses and the brain that distort things. So we all perceive things differently, even with the colors in that diagram. You know, some people will say, well, that's not a pink, that's a red. So everything has changed a lot, and we choose what we tune into again. The thing about senses is that when we focus and then unfocus, which is called toggling, we perform at our best. So if we do something for too long, our performance goes down. So in design, we always really need to remember that it's not just a combination of all the sensory inputs coming together, it's about having a bit of change as well. And 46.9% of our time is wasted when we have distractions. Just 2 quick slides about consciousness and memory here. 90% of what we do is subconscious. We only perceive 5% of things around us. And as I said, we process 40, 50 things at a time. So we always rely on shortcuts and assumptions. So when you get in the car to do a Saturday drive and you end up on your Monday to Friday drive, that's because you're doing it subconsciously. Is memory. Lots of different types of memory. You've got working and prospective, where you plan to do something in the future, you have to remember to do it. Procedural and a flashbulb memory, which you might have when there's an urgent thing going on. And because of the way the senses are processed, the speed of recalling that memory changes in everyone. The fastest recall of memory is smell and music. And when we have 3 senses together, we perform better than when we have 1. So if you give directions to say go left at the end and then second right, that's 1 sense. But if you say left at the fountain and right at the cafe, you've got some smell and you've got sound as well. So directions will work better like that. So we memorize what we've done before and we make maps in our mind. And when we move through space, we have what called event boundaries. So when we pass through a door or a staircase, part of our memory is wiped out so that we can move on to the next room. So if, for instance, you've forgotten your phone upstairs, if you say phone as you go through the door and up the stairs, your memory will process and pass that on through. And this is just a slide which demonstrates that neurodiversity is very powerful and magical. And there are lots of people who are neurodivergent who we really appreciate, not just famous people, but everyone. There are lots of skills with neurodiversity. So with lived experience, I have to put this chart up as nothing about us without us. This is a chart made up by DANDA, which is a collection of people who have lived experience of neurodiversity. And as you can see, all the oval shapes overlap. So sometimes it's difficult to put yourself in a label, whether you want a label or not, and that's up to you whether you want to. There's no obligation to have a diagnosis. So there are things which map over into other areas. So when we talk about neurodiverse, that means that everyone is neurodiverse, we're all different. Neurotypical is an assessment of what is the norm. But there is no normal in the brain because they're all different. So it's quite difficult to say what neurotypical is. If you're neurodivergent, then there's a distinct difference, and you may have a label, you may not. You may fall into one of these oval shapes. You might not decide you want to. And neurodegenerative is more about areas of the brain degenerating generally with age, so Parkinson's and dementia. Now, this is a picture of a woodland. So what I want you to do to practice designing for neurodiversity is picture yourself there and just take all the elements that you feel and take them back into your designs. Okay. What I want you to do is drop the bluebells because they're protected, and don't take the trees back because obviously they're too big for your design, your office. But everything else there that you feel, if you put into your design for neurodiversity, will work, because we're talking about an initial reaction in the primitive part of the brain. So if, for instance, you want to change the temperature, you know where the sun is, you know you can move to another area. It's a natural wayfinding shape there. You know there's light at the end, so you sense the direction. If you hear someone coming and you're not sure you want to see them, you can hide behind the tree, so you've got refuge. So that's a really good way of trying to design for neurodiversity. The patterns will be introduced in a minute, and it's divided very cleverly into sections for the simple principles of clarity, choice and control, and calm. So by clarity, we mean intuitive things that time and again you will recognize. There's a clear layout and a sight line. You know exactly what the purpose and function of something is. Everything is familiar in shapes. There's no disguising it. And you have a preview. A preview is very important. If you know what to expect, that reduces your anxiety. And in terms of choice, again, you have to move between focused, unfocused, and collaboration areas. You need to stagger those timings and be able to move smoothly between them. So one of the ways of introducing choice is to have sensory and heat maps, and then calm. So if you clear the clutter and you have muted, not vivid colours, and you keep that space to escape, to regenerate, like a plunge pool for your brain, then everything comes back into perspective and you work much better. And the final slide, please, Helen. Here we have an image of Number Parks in Osaka, a Journey partnership, and rather than focusing just on plants, which I assume everybody senses with neurodiversity design, you know, and biophilic, bring in the green. It's not just about that. It's about, you can see here, there's a view of what would appear to be a more natural scene. It looks like a canyon. So you've got the prospect, you've got the fresh air and the daylight coming in, and there are lots of features which they've built in. So what you're doing with biophilic design is creating a neural trigger. Rather than recreating it, you have a neural trigger to that primitive part of your brain. And you have a place of refuge. So you know when you're on the top of a cliff, you're going to be really safe. You can watch people who are approaching and reduce your anxiety, and the airflow and thermal quality all vary. And there are fractal patterns, but not geometrics or lines. And now, thank you. For the next slide, I will just pass over to Jean Hewitt, who will talk about the amazing PAS 6463. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, as Helen said, we're going to go over to Jean now. Jean, we're very lucky to have Jean here today because not only is she an NRAC accredited inclusive design consultant at Borough Happold, but she's also the technical author of the new PAS 6463 Design for the Mind standard by BSI, and it's going to be published in early summer. Jean is an honorary associate professor at the Bartlett, and she leads the Designing Inclusive Places module with UCL's MSc in Health, Wellbeing and Sustainable Building. So she's going to give us a little bit of a preview of what's coming with PAS and scope it out for us. So thank you, Jean, and I'll hand over to you now.
So I'm going to talk to you about the PAS 6463. Sorry, there's a typo on the page. It's not 6464, it's 6463. Designed for the Mind, Neurodiversity in the Built Environment, where it came from, and I think Helen's already given a very good explanation about why we need a standard on this. But I'll just run through some of the content as well. So I'm going to go through the background first and scope content, and then talk to you about the next steps for this standard, and hopefully an area where you can all get involved as well. So the background, we identified the need many, many years ago. We have a B559 committee at the British Standards, which looked at accessibility and inclusion. And for a long time, there have been voices requesting a standard around this area. In 2016, the BSI commissioned Helen Hamlin to undertake some research. It was qualitative research, very good research, asking lots of people with neurodivergent and neurodegenerative conditions how they felt about the built environment, what type of issues they had, and what made life difficult for them. And as a result of that, in the 2018 version of the BS 8300, which is 2 documents, I pictured those on bottom right, we have incorporated some high-level recommendations of the considerations that need to be made, but it didn't really go far enough. So in 2019, we managed to secure some funding through sponsors for developing the PAS. And if you're not familiar with the PAS, it's a publicly available specification. It's a document that is voluntary to follow and has typically a shelf life of around 2 years. And during that 2-year period, it will be evaluated in use to see what works, what doesn't. And hopefully on this one, we will develop some case studies, will reinforce some of those aspects, and hopefully also trigger some people to undertake research in some of the areas where we still don't know enough. So the sponsors that allowed that to happen with Transport for London, the main sponsor, Bureau Happold have sponsored my role as technical author. Forbo Flooring were very interested and also a sponsor because of the issues that the patterns on the floors and so forth can have, and they've done a lot of work with dementia, so they knew this was an issue and wanted to know more. And finally, BBC Workplace, who have done some pioneering work of their own in this area. So we commenced that journey in 2020. I've got a steering group of 16 experts, so I'm not the expert, I'm a technical author, and obviously I'm learning a lot as I'm going, but the steering group of experts from different fields and different disciplines, most importantly, a huge number of them have lived experience of one or more aspects of neurodiversity, and many of them working, as well as having that lived experience, working in the field as well for many, many years, decades even. So the first draft went out for public consultation in November, and it is 73 pages, and we held the comment resolution of the 1,600 or so comments received back. Some really nice, encouraging comments from many people who have neurodivergent conditions, I can say. Now we're looking at publication probably early summer. So we're pulling together the final draft now, and then it has to go through the machinery at BSI, basically, ready for publication. As I say, I have a 2-year period of evaluation use, so I'd encourage everyone to pick this up and look at it when it comes out. And it has got great potential for future incorporation into standards, most likely the BS 8300, but possibly others. It does cover design and management, so it's very important, as with all aspects of inclusion, that we take a holistic approach, and designing the building is fine, but if you don't manage the building correctly and have the appropriate policies and procedures, obviously it's not inclusive. So this applies to neurodiversity as well. The target audiences for it will be architects, designers, planners, people running the building, facility managers or estate managers, and really any decision maker or employer. And the content, I think, is relevant to most building types. We have said that specialist provision for deeper care is not necessarily covered in this initial PAS because we feel that there is more that could be done, for example, in a dementia care home or perhaps in a special educational needs environment. Although there's nothing in this PAS that will do any harm in those environments, it's just they probably don't go far enough. This was an infographic that we developed at Bureau Happold to try and portray the different key elements really of the standard. And you can see there's sort of safety and safeguarding, wayfinding, navigation. These are all areas that Helen's really touched on. Biophilic design, access to nature. The spatial layout, where Helen was talking about approximation and where we are within the space, really, really important. And acoustics and lighting were the two most important that came up in the Helen Hanlon research and other research that's been done on quiet rooms. The acoustics and lighting is really, really important, as well as some of the finishes, so patterns being a particular issue. Helen also mentioned preview, and that's also going to be part of wayfinding and navigation, but also in other ways too. So that plays a big part in making people appease their anxiety about entering a space or going somewhere or using an environment. Of these ones around the edge, you can see 3 in the middle, the calm, control and clarity, and I'll come back to an explanation of why they're sitting there. In terms of the sections within the document, we start off with developing the brief, and of course we signpost to the RIBA plan of work, and you can nicely align a lot of the considerations that you make for designing for neurodiversity with the RIBA structure, of course. Strategy and commitment are hugely important, and that's stakeholder engagement. As with any inclusive environment, it has to be rich, it has to be true engagement, and it should always happen. And for many, many years, lots of people with neurodivergent conditions just haven't had that voice. So now is the time that we need to make sure that we do that as well. All sorts of things came out of the pulling together of this standard. Surprises for me around the facade was one of those, about facades that heat up, patterns on facades, causing visual disturbances from a distance and things like that. So you'll be surprised, I think, at how much this overlays with much of the work of RIBA members. Wayfinding was a huge issue, and preview advanced information, but the appropriate wayfinding. Wayfinding was found to be a particular weakness by many people with neurodivergent conditions. And as Helen has alluded to, that you don't always get a diagnosis. I think that what I found is that there are also many people who are mainly neurotypical. So I consider myself to be neurotypical, but I have one or two sort of spikes in my neuro profile, which are very much divergent from societal norm. And one of those is wayfinding. So I understand this quite deeply myself, because I'm somebody who get lost in a single room probably. So there were lots about that, about how you give that reassurance, giving enough reminders to confirm where someone's going and the ways you do that. Obviously, there's lots in there about, there's stuff in there about biophilic and biomimicry, so mimicking nature internally, and giving people access to green space, and lots of thoughts about how you do that. There's also, this is a document, the PAS is a document that's linked to lots of other documents, because we wanted to keep it as concise as possible. So there's a lot of signposting going on to other standards and other documents that are out there. So if you're listening to this session and you know of documents that really should be linked to this PAS, it's not too late to still let me know, so please do so. There's stuff in there about internal layouts and symmetry and so on. Control over, choice of where you can sit and how quiet or how different that space is. And we've got a section on mechanical, electrical and power as well, which deals with some of the aspects around smell, so the VOCs, for example, in the building, and that you might get new carpets and formaldehyde and perfumes, products that might be used in toilets or cleaning products and so on. So it touches on that, as well as switches of controls to control the environment by the individual. Acoustics is a big one. We've taken some stuff from the building bulletin, and we work with Ecofon on the steering group for that, so they're really, really helpful, because they've done lots on dementia and neurodiversity, and also had some input from our Bureau Harold acoustics team. And lighting, lots on that, daylight and lighting, and controlling flicker was a big one. And there has been some spin-off already with some a document that lighting colleagues have written around getting the lighting right in healthcare, because throwing in LED without it being properly designed can cause more problems than sticking with the old fluorescent, which everyone thought was quite a demon for people that are hypersensitive. But LED can be just as bad if it's not done correctly. So there's a few things I've thrown in there, so colour temperature, colour rendering index, and important illumination ratios from where you are to what you're adjacent to is also matters. Lots of cross-referencing in that section, 2 different standards, and we're looking at adjustable lighting in both colour, temperature and lux output in some environments. Can't really do it on the main walkways, but you can definitely do it in some office spaces and some meeting rooms, and certainly in the quiet room it would be really, really important. Surface finishes, I mentioned about patterns. We found some interesting things around how you can reconfigure even floor tiles and to make the pattern better or worse. And there's been some scientific work being done on how you assess patterns as well. So that can be a big issue for lots of people, causing a lot of visual disturbance. Fixtures, fittings and furniture, lots there, and things to consider about how you make things quieter or safer, using natural materials and biophilic, and just how, is it logical how you use things? It's really, really important. And the quiet and restorative space, I would say, is quite a chunky chapter, and that was informed by an ex-student of mine, Tora Sadia, and she did a lot of work, had over 300 participants in her research, which is around developing a quiet space, a restorative space, because there's huge variation in how people do this, and she's got some really key findings, so I really recommend reading of that, and I think there will be further work on that, and sensory rooms, so rooms that might stimulate as well. Obviously, there is a link. So if you have a neurodivergent condition, you don't necessarily have a mental health condition or mental health illness, but there is a link, because we're not making the buildings right for people. And that is a constant issue and a strain. and people's senses are being bombarded if they are hypersensitive. So there is an overriding link that we need to look at, and I think taking some of these worst offenders out of the environment is going to be really helpful, as well as providing that place for a bit of quiet as well, and that biophilic thrown in. So in summary, those three umbrella terms I said I'll come back to, are 3 C's, basic: clarity, control, and calm. So clarity is knowing that a space is going to perform well acoustically, visually, lighting, and so forth, not causing that sensory overload, knowing where you're going, so sight lines and so on. The control is giving people choice, really. Either I can adjust the lighting, or I can pull an acoustic curtain, or I can move somewhere else. I can take myself to a quieter space. That's about control. And finally, if none of that helps, it's all too much anyway, having that place of calm, a calm space to escape to. And so those infographics are there really to just highlight some of the aspects. The link for the PAS is there at the foot of this slide, and I know these slides are going out afterwards, but that is my final slide. I think we're now going over.
Thank you, a big thank you to Jane, Helen and Jean for fantastic talks. Apologies for the technical issues that we've had today, but thank you for sticking with us, and a big thank you to Lorraine from RIBA Academy for helping us out today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye. Bye.